Beyond the Forecast with Grant Tosterud, the science of weather in New Mexico. What makes the land of enchantment so unique? To understand, let's go Beyond the Forecast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Forecast, where we dive into the science of New Mexico's weather. I'm Chief Meteorologist Grant Tosterud, joined today by Meteorologist DePhillips and our brand new meteorologist, David Burgett. So this is David's first episode. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, you guys. I'm happy to be here.
We're happy to have you, and especially happy because you really helped out with some of the research for today's episode, which I'm really excited about because it combines two things that I love. Of course, the weather. We all love that. But then some history, and specifically Albuquerque history. So this episode is going to be the one for all the history nerds out there. But of course, if you love weather, please keep watching us too. It's a really good episode. Today, we're talking about the history of the Rio Grande, the flooding here in Albuquerque, and how it's shaped the whole middle Rio Grande Valley and Albuquerque too. So before we get into some of that, who wants to go into first explaining about how the Rio Grande formed and where it is today?
Yeah, I can kind of take that away to kind of start things off. Like in this research, I kind of found out that the Rio Grande is actually the fourth longest river in the United States, spanning roughly around 1,900 miles. And it starts in the San Juan Mountains in like southern Colorado, and it goes through New Mexico into Texas and empties out in the Gulf near Brownsville, Texas. So pretty long ways and pretty amazing that it's the fourth longest river in the United States. But it really formed around 20 to 35 million years ago. And that's from the Earth's crust actually splitting apart and thinning. So what that did is that it created a small dip, I would say, in that landscape, and it created like a perfect waterway for water to take probably the path of least resistance and to just flow right into New Mexico from southern Colorado. So that's just some quick facts there.
What's really neat, too, is that this is a pretty unique geographic phenomenon, too. There's only 5 other rift valleys like this in the entire world. So it's pretty incredible that one of them is here in New Mexico, a state that geography basically defines our whole culture here as well. Right. It's, like he said, the Rift Valley caused the land to drop down, created this lower area, this natural valley, and that was the perfect place for water to flow. Without the Rift Valley here, without the crust spreading apart here, we would not have the Rio Grande at all, which is pretty incredible to think about.
It's really cool to go to the West Mesa, some of the conservancy areas. They have like little boards that explain how the rift forms too, like much more in depth to what we'll probably be explaining today, and how the Sandias just jut up like out of nowhere. It's just so fascinating.
We could have a whole episode on the geography of the Rift Valley alone, but today we're talking about the flooding. And the reason the river is there is because you used to have glaciers up in the San Juan Mountains, of course, snow up in the San Juan Mountains every year too. So when all of that melts, it flows into that natural valley and created the river that we know today. But like you said, the Rift Valley started forming about 20 to 35 million years ago. There was an ancestral version of the Rio Grande that actually formed about 4 million years ago. But the modern version of the river we love and see today formed about 1 to 2 million years ago. So it's a pretty old river.
It's a very evolving river, and it's a way of life here. Obviously.
Very much so.
Without a river, it would be a lot different here.
Yeah.
Let's just say that.
Yeah, I like the way they compare it too. It's kind of like North America's version of the Nile. You know, we live in a desert. The only reason that civilization is here is because of the Rio Grande. In Albuquerque, unlike many other rivers, you think of rivers as carving through the ground. That's not really what happened here in the middle section of the Rio Grande. It happened up north. You can think of the Rio Grande Gorge. That's where the river's a perfect example of carving through the ground. But here, it just flowed along the valley. We didn't see it carve a big depression into the ground, unlike a lot of other rivers that create this very well-defined valley. The river meandered across where it is today, where Albuquerque is today, and generally deposited a lot of sediment. In fact, you can even look to see on the ground, and you could trace back to where the river used to flow. They found sediments from the river as far east as Eubank even.
Very cool.
So it's really covered a large area. And then, you go back and start to trace when people lived here and people settled around what is now Albuquerque about 12,000 years ago. One of my favorite facts about this area is that, the Albuquerque area is one of the longest continually inhabited areas in all of North America. And again, all because of the river, right? It's really fascinating. Cool. 12,000 years ago, people began settling in this area. They were known as the Paleo Indians. And then, of course, we've had a lot of history since then. And every group of people and civilization that has called this area home has had a close relationship with the river. Modern people today, too. And so flooding has been a long part of this history as well, which has completely shaped the way people live and have interacted with the river, even in modern day Albuquerque.
Very true. Yeah. You know, the river, a way of life, but of course, precautions always needed when you have a river as mighty and old as the Rio Grande.
And you say mighty too. We think today of the Rio Grande as a pretty quiet, tame river, but that wasn't always the way it was exactly. In fact, there was centuries of stories of flooding along the river and the devastation that it caused. So we're going to cover some of that history. We've got a lot of really cool stories coming up, so stay with us. We'll be right back. Well, the Rio Grande is a really old river, and it has had a long history of how the river has formed and how people have lived along it and interacted with it too. And a lot of the flooding that we're about to talk about has completely shaped the way that people live in central New Mexico and live with the river. And it's had a long and storied history too, from being uncontrollable and flash flooding and devastating to kind of the quiet and tame and even sometimes running dry river we know today. So before we get into some of this history, I really want to thank and credit this fantastic book. If you're into Albuquerque history, I highly recommend it. It's called Albuquerque, A Narrative History by Mark Simmons. This is where we took a lot of this research from, and we're going to share with you today. So we're going to start out back at the beginning again. Geologic studies show that the river once flowed a different course through Albuquerque. With each springtime flood, the Rio Grande left its banks. It flooded this valley area. And about 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, the river ran in a nearly straight line from Alameda to downtown, but a flood caused it to shift to a new path, forming that westward curve we see today and still continues today. In fact, Alameda was once on the west side of the Rio Grande. Today we know it as it being on the east side. You have to cross the river to get to the west side of Albuquerque now. And that changing course was very normal for the river up until about 1957, in fact.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Even back then, we didn't have that many records of what was happening. So, we tried to get as much information as much as possible. And it's also very strategic how they built the town. Old Town Albuquerque, right? On the higher elevations of Albuquerque so that the floodwaters would mostly, hopefully, elude the area.
Yeah. In fact, the original governor of Nuevo Mexico, when it was a territory of Spain, his name is Governor Francisco Cuervo y Valdez. He chose the spot for the Villa de Albuquerque specifically because it was a little bit higher than the surrounding areas.
Right.
It would protect it from the flooding. But that flooding was also crucial because the seasonal floods deposited the silt on the ground, which made it very fertile land, and that led to a lot of the agricultural society that built up around the original villa, which today we know as Old Town Albuquerque. And then you were going to fast forward a little bit because that was all in the 1700s.
Right.
We're always, like we said, there weren't a lot of good records from the Spanish or Native Americans to talk about the kind of flooding they experienced. So we're flash forwarding now to 1828 when there was records of a massive flood that swept through the region. In fact, floodwaters stretched all the way from Bernalillo down to El Paso. Not a lot of records of this, but the damage was likely considerable along the whole path of this river.
Especially without any kind of mechanisms to control the waters that would flow all the way throughout New Mexico just to get to Texas and the Gulf.
Yeah, or some kind of warning system to prepare against it too. Exactly.
Right, and we're going to be talking about more floods, and we can see how our technology has evolved over time to counteract the flooding.
Yeah.
Right.
So in 1874, the Rio Grande flooded its banks again and into its old channel, which was kind of to the east of where it was now, flowing down that East Valley, leaving Albuquerque, or what is Old Town now, right? It kind of left it in maroon because they built it up slightly higher. So it basically turned itself into an island because everywhere else flooded around it.
Wow.
Back then, the Old Town shopkeepers, they loaded up their merchandise onto wagons and fled for the hills on the east side of Albuquerque, where they had to live for weeks in tents because they were waiting for those waters to recede to finally be able to go back to Old Town and set up their shop again. In fact, the town of Alameda, which you're going to hear us talk about a lot in this episode, was completely or almost nearly wiped out from this flooding.
Yeah, I mean, there's just been, it's going to be a recurring theme as we go through history here. And telling this is going to be multiple floods that happen along the Rio Grande as it was starting to form. Settlements were starting to form there also. But also in 1880, Newtown Albuquerque was created following the arrival of Topeka, Atchison, and the Santa Fe Railroad. So it was a lot of the vulnerable flooding being several feet lower into that, what I would assume a dip, in the old river channel, and that probably led to a lot of flash flooding once we got heavy rainfalls too.
Yeah. So when we say Newtown, Albuquerque, that's what we mean by modern day downtown. You think of the railroad station down there. That's why Albuquerque moved that way, because the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad set up the depot there. And so Albuquerque kind of moved in that direction too. But what they didn't consider is that that was in the old flood channel of the river. That was the river's original path. So when the river flooded, it followed that old path as well, and they ran into a lot of problems with that.
Right. And then 1883, fast forwarding a little bit, the River Commission was formed by Bernalillo County, levied funds to build earthworks at locations to really help the Rio Grande, hopefully not, really have water breaking through the banks, right? And then there was a subsequent event that we're going to be talking about because of the following year, May 1984, is actually, of course, the winter where most of these floods are caused by snowpack, right, and melting. Really, the Santa Fe New Mexican was warning unprecedented amounts of water coming in from Colorado into New Mexico.
Yeah, their title of the paper was Unprecedented Snows in Southern Colorado the Past Winters Are Melting and Floods on the Rio Grande Are Creating Alarm Along the Valley. So this news got down to Albuquerque. Many prepared for this flood to be the mightiest flood in memory, and that's a direct quote from people at the time. So civic leaders, the mayor, other people in Albuquerque, they took a tour of what kind of preparations needed to be done for the flooding and realized that the greatest threat, their weakest point, was actually up in Alameda. Again, bringing up Alameda, where the river looped west and into the old channel. Remember, that's where it used to carve this straight line. And then we had another flood. The river carved that westward path that we see today.
Thinking about the power of water there.
Yeah, so that's what they were most concerned about. So they started to build a dike, which is meant to redirect the water. And it was meant to protect Alameda and divert the water away from New Albuquerque, so we wouldn't see the kind of flooding like they saw in just a couple years prior when Newtown was set up. And when the water came, the plan worked. Yes, besides a few breaks or cracks in the dike, overall it worked well. However, several bridges over the river were damaged or destroyed from the flooding. South of Bareilles towards Peralta, Valencia, Tomé, and Belen, they were almost completely underwater from this flooding. So while it protect Albuquerque, downstream, a lot of people and places were flooded pretty badly. And this water stuck around for a while. By the last week of May, the riverbed was flooded from the Espanola Valley all the way down to Mesilla, which is down near Las Cruces. And it wasn't until June 5th that the Rio Grande crested in Albuquerque, but water nearly toppled the dikes near Alameda. This is a really cool story too. 500 people from Albuquerque, Alameda, Sandia Pueblo went to go and reinforce the embankment with sandbags and brush. And then a few days later, news from Tao said that most of the snow had melted from up in the northern mountains. And the Rio Grande in Albuquerque was really slow to recede, though. It wasn't until the first half of July that they started to see a decrease in the water. Incredible. And it wasn't until August 18th that rail service across the river began again. So this was probably one of the most prolific floods back in the day. The flooding problem here in Albuquerque really wasn't dealt with until 1923 when the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District was created to provide flood protection from the river. It was supposed to drain the swamplands around Albuquerque and deal with some of the flooding. So we have some really neat pictures here of when all of these efforts began to try and create these ditches and acequia systems around Albuquerque that we all know so well today. A lot of these are almost 100 years old. And by 1935, the Conservancy District had built the storage dam at Alvaro and the diversion dams at Cochiti, Angostura, Isleta, and Santa Casia to manage the water. Conservancy District also dug 17 miles of drainage and irrigation canals and incorporated another 214 miles of existing canals into the system, nearly 200 miles of riverside levees, and a system of jetty jacks and checks along the side of the river to protect against flooding. So they really did a lot during those couple of decades.
Yeah, really good. And they did that. 1950 Army Corps of Engineers constructed the Jemez Canyon Dam. So we were talking about other rivers to protect against flash floods. The Jemez River, the Abiquiu Dam. Following that, also we talked about some of those dams, and the Cochiti Dam in the 1970s. So it's not just the Rio Grande, it's the other rivers too.
Yeah, all these lakes that people know, they recreate in, they think about, and those lakes were all built to help protect flooding along the Rio Grande.
Right.
But despite hopefully thinking they solved the problem, there's still a major risk of flash flooding even today in Albuquerque. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the state of the river today and some of the issues we're running into. We'll be right back. So the Rio Grande has had a long history of flooding and impacting the people that lived around the river. But recently, we've constructed a lot of dams, levees, canals, acequias to help protect against flooding here in Albuquerque. And so far that has worked. But the Rio Grande is a really interesting river in that it's kept flowing by a reason that not a lot of rivers in the country are.
Yeah.
The big reason for that is spring snow melt. Of course, that's the main reason that keeps the river flowing. If we have a good winter, we're going to have a good flowing river through Albuquerque and through New Mexico. Monsoon rains in the summer mainly just act as a Band-Aid, and that's about it. It can help to increase levels a little bit, but it could very well run much lower shortly after that. In fact, 75% of the water along the Rio Grande comes from seasonal snowpack up in Colorado and the mountains here in New Mexico, too.
Yeah, a lot of snow is good when it melts and it goes through not just the Rio Grande, but remember, you got other estuaries, you got other arroyos feeding into the river, and just the overall land, right? And then, of course, as our climate changes, something that has been evolving, right?
Yeah.
Less snowpack, warmer weather, drier weather, generally has changed how the river has been flowing.
Climate change is probably the biggest threat to the Rio Grande and its health in terms of water supply. We know our climate is warming. That's a fact. It's not debatable. And as our climate warms, less precipitation falls as snow and more snow melts during the winter. So therefore, that decreases the snowpack and the amount of snow that accumulates over the winter. So what we really like to see is that snowpack build up and then slowly release in the spring. That means we're going to have a really healthy river throughout the summer. But if we're to look at this figure here, since the 1950s, the snowpack has been decreasing in New Mexico as well as in southern Colorado, which are the headwaters of the Rio Grande, which matters because that means we're going to have less water for the Rio Grande down the line. So this map shows us that not only in New Mexico, but across much of the western United States, this is measured in terms of snow water equivalent, which if you were to take a column of snow, melt it down to its water equivalent, those blue circles you see represent increased snowpack from the 1950s through today, but the red circles represent a decrease. And you can see almost the entire western part of the country is seeing a decrease in snowpack. And especially in northern New Mexico, our average snowpack has decreased 20 to 80% from 1955 to 2023.
Substantial. And,
Very substantial.
Yeah, and really what we've talked about recently is drought, and of course attributing to that, mega drought took hold in 2000, and not just for our area of the southwest United States, really impacting, of course, our way of life.
Yeah, and ever since we made the Rio Grande Compact, at least in the 1930s, that was a deal allocating the river water between Colorado, New Mexico, and also in Texas for irrigation. And in my research, I do remember that we're currently in a deficit that is, I believe, Texas for that. So anyways, New Mexico, like we must deliver water to the Elephant Butte Reservoir, which serves as a measuring point for Texas's share, so they can get their water too. But pretty much meeting through the terms has become more of a challenge due to that shrinking snowpack and less of that snow melting into that Rio Grande and following that path of least resistance. So that's something when I first came here and doing all this research, I found very surprising. Yeah. That the least amount, we're getting less snow each year, it seems like.
But the percentage of water we have to give has not changed. So that's the struggle to keep up with the amount of water we're supposed to give away, despite seeing the decrease in snowpack and decrease in water levels in the spring and early summer. And for the first time in 40 years, back in 2022, stretches of the river actually ran dry because of a record low snowpack. That year, 12 miles of the river around Albuquerque dried up and 32 miles of the river dried up near Socorro as well.
Yeah, incredible. And the river ran dry again this past year. So what's the future going to hold, right? How are we going to inform people? And I think one of the big things is to at least partially try to help out with municipalities, education, the public school system. Say New Mexico released a 50-year water action plan, and that was last year in 2024. So to kind of help out, educating people, help out the municipalities, hopefully counteract what's happening.
So that's the future of the Rio Grande exactly is, we got to do our part to conserve some of that water. We can hope for good winters. We can hope for good monsoon rains that are going to keep the water flowing. But in reality, we have to take steps as people to hopefully keep the river flowing and replenish some of that water supply too. And things that you could do at your own home. Use less water, take shorter showers. I think one of the bigger things here, especially in Albuquerque and New Mexico, is xeriscaping. That's another great thing to do too. Get rid of the grass because it requires so much water. Put down rocks, plant native plants that require very little water or maybe no water at all. Native plants like that are going to make it a lot easier on the water supply for Albuquerque and to, keep the water flowing in the river and keep it a healthy ecosystem as well.
Yeah, great points there.
So David, I'm curious, with all of this research, what's the thing that stood out to you the most?
Honestly, I would say it was, like we said before, that snowpack. And what really stuck out to me was that deficit we are in between Texas, so all of that. But also, I remember reading through that book that you did recommend that we just got a lot of those research from, is that some of those personal accounts that I was reading throughout there of the floods throughout New Mexico, or Albuquerque's history. And I know we can't get totally into it, but maybe for another episode. But one of them was just personal accounts and if someone hearing the roaring and the rushing of the waters as the floods came through. And also there was a train accident I think a flash flood.
From the monsoon rains.
From the monsoon rains in the Sandia. So that led to a train accident and 2 people, I think, died during that.
Yeah,
so.
I agree. That is another episode we'll have to do in the future.
Right.
Wow. A lot of fascinating history of weather in Albuquerque and the way we interact with it here in New Mexico. Well, thank you so much for watching. Remember, you can always stay up to the date with weather by watching KRQE, going to krqe.com, or by tuning in to Kirky Now. You can find us all on social media for the latest weather updates. Thank you again for watching Beyond the Forecast. Stay tuned for another episode.